The Old Man and the Boy by Robert Ruark. Chapter 1. It takes a gentleman to approach another gentleman. The old man knows pretty near close to everything, and mostly he ain't painful with it. What I mean is that he went to Africa once when he was a kid, and he shot a tiger or two out in India, or so he says, and he was in a whole mess of wars here and yonder, but he can still tell you why the quails sleep at night in a tight circle, or why the turkeys always fly uphill. The old man ain't much to look at on the hoof. He's got big ears that flap out and a scrubby mustache with light yellow tobacco stains on it. He smokes a crook stem pipe and shoots an old pump gun that looks about as battered as he does. His pants wrinkle and he spits pretty straight in the way people used to spit when most grown men chewed apple tobacco. The thing I like best about the old man is that he's willing to talk about what he knows, and he never talks down to a kid, which is me, who wants to know things. When you are as old as the old man, you know a lot of things that you forgot you ever knew, because they've been a part of you so long. You forgot that a young'un hasn't had as hard a start on the world as you did, and you don't bother to spread the information around. You forget that other people might be curious about what you already knew and forgot. Like the other day when we called the dogs and the old man and I went out into the woods to see if there were any quail around. Turned out there were some quail around. Pete, who is the pointer, whirled around like he was crazy, and then he stuck his tail straight up in the air and settled down in a corner of the pea field as if he planned to spend the winter. "I ain't shooting much these days," the old man said. "You'd better do it for me. Take my gun and walk in past Pete now. Walk gentle, kick up the birds without making the dogs nervous, and let's see if you can get one bird. Don't worry about the second one. Just concentrate on the first one. You gotta kill the first one before you can shoot the second one. It's what we call a rule of thumb. Suppose you try it to see if it works." I walked in past Pete, and the birds came up like rockets on the 4th. And I did what most people do at first. I shot all of them, all at the same time. I fired both barrels, and nothing dropped at all. I looked at the old man, and he looked at me, kind of sorrowful. He shook his head, reached for his pipe, and made a great to-do about tamping down the tobacco and lighting it with a kitchen match. "Son," he said, "I've missed a lot of birds in my time, and I will miss some more if I shoot at enough of them. But there's one thing I know that you might as well learn now. Nobody can kill the whole covey, not even if they shoot the birds on the ground running down a row in a cornfield. You gotta shoot them one at a time." The old man said we ought to give the dogs a little more time because the birds wouldn't be moving as singles the very moment they hit, and they left most of their body scent up in the air anyhow. So why didn't we sit while he smoked his pipe, and then we would go and pick up the singles? The old man said he didn't know what I would be when I grew up, and didn't care a lot, but he said I might as well learn to respect quail, if only for practice in the respect of people. This little Bob White, the old man told me, was a gentleman, and you had to approach him as a gentleman to gentleman. You had to cherish him and look after him, and make him very important in his own right, because there weren't many of him around, and he was worthy of respectful shooting. The way you handled quail sort of kicked back on you. Figure it this way, the old man said. A covey of quail is a member of your family. You treat him right, and it stays there with you for all the years you live. It works in and around your garden, and it eats the bugs, and it whistles every evening and cheers you up. It keeps your dogs happy because they've got something to play with, and when you shoot it just so many, and then you don't shoot it any more that year, because you got to leave some seed birds to breed you a new covey for the next year. There ain't nothing as nice as taking the gun down off the hook and calling up the dogs and going out to look for a covey of quail you got real good chance to find, the old man said. The little fellow doesn't weigh about 5 ounces, but every ounce of him is pure class. He's smart as a whip, and every time you go up against him, you're proving something about yourself. I never knew a man that hunted quail that didn't come out of it a little politer by comparison, the old man said. Associating with gentlemen can't hurt you. If you intend to hunt quail, you have to keep remembering things like you can't shoot rabbits in front of a dog, or you'll take his mind off the quail. And then you have to worry about the dogs some too. A dog that won't backstand a point, honor it is the word. A dog that won't concede to another dog is a useless dog. You might as well shoot him. One of the troubles with this world is that everybody is crowding and pushing and shoving, and if your dog hasn't got any manners, he hasn't got any real right to be a dog. The same way with a dog that chases rabbits. If he's a hound, let him go chase rabbits. but a setter dog or a pointer dog hasn't got any right to indulge himself in chasing rabbits. It is what the people in Washington call a non-essential luxury. A dog or a man has got to do what he has got to do to earn his keep, and he's got to do it right." The old man smiled and sucked on his pipe. "I mind well a little setter named Lou," he said. "Belonged to an old friend of mine named Joe Hesketh. She was about as dumb a dog as I ever saw in the field, but she was loyal. She was real loyal. She was a real backstanding kind of a dog." Joe's first real bird-finding dog was a big old Gordon setter who was about as black as your hat. He was named Jet. He looked like a charred stump when he pointed at a bird. He was as stanch as a stump and as black as a stump. So Lou spent her whole life pointing stumps. You would walk through the broom grass in the savannas, and there was poor old Lou froze solid on a burnt stump. There wasn't much Lou could do except backstand, but that was the best backstandingest dog I ever saw. She made a career out of it, and never got to hate it. Her eyes failed her finally, and she got killed. She backstood a fire plug in the middle of a busy street, and she wouldn't break her point for an automobile that was coming along in a hurry. The old man smiled some more, in the gentle evil way he had, and made a new essay for himself. "Fellow can learn a lot about living from watching dogs," he said, "like about snakes and terrapins. The best bird dog in the world will point a terrapin, and he will point a snake, but he won't back off a terrapin. He will point a snake and walk backward away from it, and this is what the dog would call a public service. But when a good bird dog points a rabbit, he cocks his ears peculiar and looks over his shoulder at you with a real guilty look, like he was stealing an apple from the fruit stand, and you know he expects a lickin'. He knows it just as he knows it when he gets himself all roused up and runs through a covey of birds, or when he hard-mouths a dead bird and he knows it's wrong. Never underestimate a dog. If he's got sense enough to be bred from a family with a nose and a sense of decency, any mistake you let him make is your fault." The old man said that he had kind of gotten off the subject of quail, which is a way he has of explaining that even an old man can get wrought up, and then he came back to the original subject. He said that any man with brains would never change a covey of quail from the original acre that they loved to live in. "The quail is a member of the family," the old man said again. "He expects to get fed like any other member of the family. So you plant him some field peas or some ground peas or some lespedza or something, and then you leave it there for him to eat. You plant it close to a place he can fly to hide in. A bobwhite is pretty well set in his habits. He will walk off from where he's roosted, but he likes to fly home. It's a shame," the old man said, "that the human race wouldn't take a tip from this." "But there's a stupid thing about quail like there is about people," the old man said. "He won't let well enough alone. He starts a war and puts himself out of business just like we do, which is why we have wars and famines and even game laws, which I'm basically in favor of, because they keep people and birds careful. If you don't lay the law of sound economics on a quail bird, he will start fights in the family and inbreed himself and eventually will kill himself off. The cock bird fights and then the hen birds cannibalize the eggs, and all of a sudden, where you had birds, there aren't any. This is no good for anybody, including the birds, the bugs, and you, not to mention the dogs. So you shoot 'em down to a reasonable minimum each year. Let's say there's a covey of 20. You shoot 'em down to half. The foxes will get some, and the wild tame cats will get some more. And of the 2 clutches they try to hatch that year, the weather will get one. But if you cherish 'em enough and don't get greedy, you can keep them in the backyard forever." "Just before I met your grandmother," the old man said, "I dug into a place down south and I was interested in dogs. I lived there 30 years, and I trained all the dogs that I owned on that same covey of birds in the same backyard. While I trained the dogs, I trained some young'uns too. This used to be called laissez-faire by the French. I trained the birds to stay close to the house. I trained the dogs to be polite to the birds in the nesting season. I trained the children to be polite to the dogs while the dogs were being polite to the birds. I never shot over those birds more than 3 times a year, and I never shot more than 3 out of the covey at once. And I never shot the covey down to less than 50%. And I planted food for them all the time," the old man said. "They were guests in the house, so to speak." "There's a lot I could tell you about birds," the old man said, "but I find I'm talking too much lately. If you can remember to take your time and never to shoot at the whole covey, if you can remember to keep them fed right, and if you can remember to make your dogs respect the birds, well," the old man said, "what I just delivered was a sermon about respect. I might say that it will cover most situations, whether it's bobwhite, quail, or people. This ain't a very expensive gun, the old man said. It's not a handmade gun, and it hasn't got any fancy engraving on it, but it'll shoot where you hold her, and if you hold her true, she'll kill what you're aiming at. Someday when you go to work and get rich, you can take a trip to England and buy yourself a set of matched doubles, or you can get a special job built in this country with a lot of gold bird dogs on it. But for you to learn to shoot with, this is all the gun you need right now. It was maybe the most beautiful gun a boy ever had, especially if he was only 8 years old at the time, and the old man had decided that he could be trusted with a dangerous firearm. A little 20 gauge, it was only a $20 gun, but $20 was a lot of money in those days, and you could buy an awful lot with it. The old man stuffed his pipe and stuck it under his mustache, and sort of cocked his big stick-out ears at me like a setter dog looking at a rabbit he ain't supposed to recognize socially. In a minute, he said, I aim to whistle up the dogs and let you use this thing the best way you can. But before we go out to the woods, I want to tell you one thing. You have got my reputation in your hands right now. Your mother thinks I'm an old idiot to give a shirt-tailed boy a gun that is just about as tall as the boy is. I told her I'd be personally responsible for you and the gun and the way you use it. I told her that any time a boy is ready to learn about guns is the time he's ready, no matter how young he is, and you can't start too young to learn how to be careful. What you got in your hands is a dangerous weapon. It can kill you, or kill me, or kill the dog. You always got to remember that when a gun is loaded, it makes a potential killer out of the man that's handling it. Don't you ever forget it. I said I wouldn't forget it. I never did forget it. The old man put on his hat and whistled for Frank and Sandy. We walked out to the back of the house where the tame covey was. It was a nice November day, with the sun warm and the breeze not too stiff, and still some golden red left in the leaves. We came to a fence, a low barbed wire fence, and I climbed it, holding the gun high up with one hand and gripping the fence post with the other. I was halfway over when the barbed wire sort of caught in the crotch of my pants, and the old man hollered. Whoa, the old man said. Now ain't you a silly sight, stuck on a barbed wire fence with a gun waving around in the breeze and one foot in the air and the other foot on a piece of limber wire? I guess I am at that, I said. I'm going to be pretty naggy at you for a while, the old man said. When you do it wrong, I'm going to call you. I know you haven't loaded that gun yet, and no matter what happens, nobody's going to get shot because you decide to climb a fence with a gun in your hand. But if you make a habit out of it, someday you'll climb one with the loads in the gun, and your foot'll slip, and the trigger will catch in the barbed wire, and the gun will go off and shoot you or me or someone else, and then it'll be too late to be sorry. There's a lot of fences around woods and fields, he said. You'll be crossing fences for the rest of your life. You might as well start now to do it right. When you climb a fence, you lay the gun on the ground under the fence with the safety on, 10 foot away from where you intend to cross the fence. You got the muzzle sticking in the opposite direction from where you're going. After you've crossed the fence, you go back and pick up the gun and look at it to see if the safety is still on. You make a habit of this too. It don't cost nothing to look once in a while and see if the safety's on. We walked on for a spell until we hit the corner of the cornfield. Old Sandy, the lemon and white setter, was sailing around with his nose in the air, taking the outside edge, and Frank, who was pretty old and slow, was making some serious game with his nose on the ground. In a minute, Sandy got a message and went off at a dead gallop. He pulled up in full stride and froze by a clump of gallberry bushes. Frank picked up a little speed on the trail and headed up to Sandy. He raised his head once and saw that Sandy was on the point and stood him stiff and pretty. Maybe you've seen prettier pictures, but I haven't. Can I really shoot it now? I said. Load her up, the old man said. Then walk in. When the birds get up, pick one out and shoot 'em. I loaded and walked up to the dogs and slipped off the safety catch. It made a little click that you could hardly hear, but the old man heard it. Whoa, he said. Give me the gun. I was mystified and my feelings were hurt because it was my gun. The old man had given it to me, and now he was taking it away from me. He switched his pipe to the outboard corner of his mustache and walked in behind the dogs. He wasn't looking at the ground where the birds were. He was looking straight ahead of him, with the gun held across his body at a 45-degree angle. The birds got up, and the old man jumped the gun up. As it came up, his thumb flicked the safety off, and the gun came smooth up under his chin, and he seemed to fire the second it got there. About 25 yards out, a bird dropped in a shower of feathers. Fetch, the old man said, unloading the other shell. Why'd you take the gun away from me? I yelled. I was mad as a wet hen. It's my gun. It ain't your gun. I'll tell you why I took the gun away from you, the old man said. You'll never forget it, will you? You bet I won't forget it, I said, still mad and about to cry. I told you I was going to nag you some, if only to satisfy your mother. This is part of the course. You'll never walk into a covey of birds or anything else any more without remembering the day I took your new gun away from you. I don't even know why you took it, I said. What'd I do wrong then? Safety catch, he said. No reason in the world for a man to go blundering around with the catch off his gun. You don't know the birds are going to get up where the dog says they are. Maybe they're running on you. So the dog breaks point and you stumble along behind him and fall in a hole or trip over a rock and the gun goes off. Bluey. You got to take it off sometime if you're planning to shoot something, I said. Habit is a wonderful thing, the old man said. It's just as easy to form good ones as it is to make bad ones. Once they're made, they stick. There's no earthly use of slipping the safety off a gun until you're figuring to shoot it. There's plenty of time to slip it off while she's coming to your shoulder after the birds are up. Shooting a shotgun is all reflexes anyhow. The way you shoot it is simply this. You carry her across your body, pointing away from the man you're shooting with. You look straight ahead. When the birds get up, you look at a bird. Then your reflexes work. The gun comes up under your eye, and while it's coming up, your thumb slips the safety, and your finger goes to the trigger. And when your eye's on the bird and your finger's on the trigger, the gun just goes off and the bird drops. It's every bit as simple as that, if you start it out right. Try it a few times and snap her dry at a pine cone or something. I threw the gun up and snapped. The gun went off with a horrid roar and scared me so bad I dropped it on the ground. Uh-huh, the old man said sarcastically. I thought you might have enough savvy to check the breech and see if she was loaded before you dry-fired her. If you had, you'd have seen that I slipped the shell back in when you weren't looking. You might have shot me or one of the dogs, just taking things for granted. That ended the first lesson. I'm a lot older now, of course, but I never forgot the old man taking the gun away and then palming that shell and slipping it back into the gun to teach me caution. All the words in the world wouldn't have equaled the object lesson he taught me just by those 2 or 3 things. And he said another thing as we went back to the house. The older you get, the carefuler you'll be. When you're as old as I am, you'll be so scared of a firearm that every young man you know will be calling you an old maid. But old maids don't shoot the heads off their friends in duck blinds or fire into a bush where a deer walked in and then go pick up their best buddy with a hole in his chest. We went back to the house and up to the old man's room. He stirred up the fire and reached into a closet and brought out a bottle of old corn liquor. He poured himself half a glassful and sipped at it. He smacked his lips. Long as we're on the subject, he said, when you get bigger, I suppose you'll start to smoke and drink this stuff. Most people do. You might remember that nobody ever got hurt with a gun if he saved his drinking for the fireside after the day's hunt was over, with the guns cleaned and in a rack or in a case. I notice you ain't broken your gun yet, let alone clean it, and it's standing in a corner for a child to get a hold of or a dog to knock it over. I suggest you clean her now. That way you know there aren't any shells left in her. That way she don't rust, and since you have to break her down to clean her, you might as well put her in a case. Maybe you think the old man was cranky, because I did then, but I don't anymore. I've seen just about everything happen with a gun. One fellow I know used to stand like Daniel Boone with his hands crossed on the muzzle of his shotgun, and one day something mysterious happened, and the gun went off, and now he doesn't have any hands anymore, which makes it inconvenient for him. I've seen drunks messing with unloaded guns, and the guns go off in the house, sobering everybody up. An automatic went crazy on me in a duck blind one day and fired every shot in the magazine. Habit had the gun pointing away from the other fellow, or I'd shot off his head with the gun that was leaping like a crazy fire hose. I saw a man shoot his foot nearly off with a rifle he thought he'd ejected all the cartridges out of, and I saw another man on a deer hunt fire into a bush a buck went into and make a widow out of his best friend's wife. The old man nagged at me and hacked at me for about 3 years. One time I forgot and climbed a fence with a loaded gun, and he took a stick to me. You ain't too big to be beat, he said, if you ain't adult enough to remember what I told you about guns and fences. This'll hurt your feelings, even if it don't hurt your hide. When I was 11, the old man stole my little 20 gauge from me. He grinned sort of evilly and announced that he was an Indian giver in the best and strongest sense. I was puzzled, but not very, because the old man was a curious cuss and a kind of devious mover. I went back to my bedroom later, and on the bed was a 16 double with a leather case that had my name on it. There were engravings of quail and dogs in silver on the sides, and my name was on the silver butt plate. The old man was taking a drink for his nervous stomach when I busted into his room with the new gun clutched in my hands. He grinned over the glass. "That there's your graduation present," he said. "It's been 3 years since we started this business, and you ain't shot me, you, or the dogs. I figure it's safe to turn you loose now, but I'll take that one away from you if you get too big for your britches and start waving it around careless. Well, I'm a lot older now, and I've seen a lot of silly fools misusing guns and scaring the daylights out of careful people, but they never had the old man for a tutor. Some people just ain't as lucky as other people."